This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about something quieter, something that moved faster than public attention, something that happened in hours, not months, while the cameras were pointed elsewhere. While you were watching the visible drama, an invisible line was crossed. Courts were told to stand down. Money was placed out of reach, and the justification wasn't justice or safety or democracy. It was urgency. A national emergency was declared not because of immediate danger to you, but because certain funds needed to be protected before anyone could touch them, not seized, not questioned, not delayed. This wasn't done in secret. It was done cleanly, legally, on paper, and that's the part that matters. Because when law is suspended selectively, it's never temporary. It's a signal. If you stay with me for a few minutes, you'll see why this moment matters far beyond one country, and why what was protected tells us exactly what comes next. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. What actually controls the system now isn't ideology. It isn't elections. It isn't even governments in the traditional sense. It's velocity plus authority, the ability to move faster than oversight, faster than courts, faster than public understanding. What you're watching is not policy being debated. It's power being exercised at speed. Because when an executive can declare an emergency and instantly reclassify money, that money stops being economic. It becomes strategic. Courts don't disappear. They're just paused. Creditors don't lose their claims. They're just told to wait. And waiting in moments like this changes outcomes. This is the pivot most people miss. Control today doesn't come from owning resources outright. It comes from controlling the legal environment around them. Who can touch what? When and under which rules? That's why this isn't about personalities. Personalities rotate, mechanisms persist. And once a mechanism proves it works, once it succeeds quietly, it doesn't stay exceptional. It becomes reusable. That's the unsettling part. Because this didn't begin with force. It began with normalization. And that's where the real shift starts to reveal itself. There was a time when this kind of move would have been unthinkable, not illegal, unthinkable. A time when courts were assumed to be immovable, when contracts meant something even during conflict, when emergency was a word reserved for immediate danger, not strategic convenience. That time didn't end with an announcement. It faded. Slowly, piece by piece, exceptions were introduced. Temporary measures, limited scopes, special circumstances. Each one reasonable on its own. Each one forgettable once the moment passed. Until the exception became familiar and familiarity became permission. That's the silent shift. Not the seizure of power, but the dulling of resistance to it. You don't notice it when it happens gradually. That's why it works. Because the most dangerous change isn't the kind that shocks you. It's the kind that trains you. Trains you to accept that rules can bend, that process can pause, that outcomes matter more than procedure. And once that mindset settles in, it doesn't stay confined to one case. It spreads, which brings us to the first visible shock. The moment when this quiet system reveals what it's capable of doing. Then the shock arrived. Not as chaos, as coordination, 17 hours. That's the distance between a sitting head of state being taken into custody on foreign soil and corporate executives sitting inside the White House discussing 9-figure investments. Not after stabilization, not after reconstruction, before, while the public was absorbed in spectacle, the footage, the arrest, the legal drama, something else happened off camera. A document was signed quietly, precisely. A national emergency was declared, not because markets were crashing, not because civilians were in immediate danger, but because money, specific money, had to be placed out of reach. Courts were told they could not touch it. Creditors were told they would have to wait. That is not symbolic. That is operational. Because the moment those funds are shielded, the future becomes negotiable. Deals can be made, frameworks can be built, risks can be transferred away from the people entering the room last. This is the point where the story stops being dramatic and starts being structural. And here's the part most coverage skips. This move wasn't defensive. It was preparatory, because you don't lock money down unless you already know who it's being opened up for next. And that raises a much more uncomfortable question: how this system actually works when the cameras leave. This is where the mechanism comes into focus, because beneath the language of emergencies and sovereignty, there's a very simple structure at work. Risk is being redistributed, not eliminated, moved. When courts are blocked, uncertainty doesn't vanish. It's just shifted away from the people with leverage and onto everyone else. Here's how it works. Incoming capital needs predictability, not morality, not stability for the population, predictability for returns. But predictability doesn't exist when past claims are enforceable, when arbitration awards can be collected, when courts can interrupt timelines, so the system intervenes upstream. Legal access is sealed. Assets are reclassified. Time is bought. The beneficiaries are obvious, but rarely named. They're the ones who arrive after disruption, not before it. The ones who didn't absorb the losses of collapse, but inherit the upside of reopening. And the damage doesn't disappear. It's absorbed quietly by displaced populations, by frozen creditors, by institutions told to defer. This is why the language matters so much. Because emergency doesn't describe danger, it describes priority. And once that priority is established, everything downstream begins to reorganize around it, which is why the next phase isn't slower, it's faster. And much harder to stop. Then the pace accelerates. There's no long explanation anymore. New public debate, things just start happening. Announcements arrive before context. Meetings happen before justification. Decisions are framed as inevitable. Production targets, investment figures, timelines, each one presented as technical, boring, already decided, but look closely at the order. Stability is promised after access, reconstruction after extraction, relief after contracts are signed. That sequence is not accidental. It's the tell, because once capital is committed, reversal becomes unthinkable. Not illegal, unthinkable. At that point, the question stops being whether this should happen. It becomes how quickly it can be normalized. And normalization moves fast, faster than courts can respond, faster than oversight can organize, faster than most people realize. Anything has changed. This is the second shock. Not loud, not violent. Administrative. And administrative power is the hardest kind to fight, because it looks like process instead of force. By the time you notice the consequences, the system is already pointing forward toward lives it hasn't accounted for yet. And that's where this stops being abstract. Because this isn't happening somewhere else. It's happening in ways that reach directly into your life. This is the point where you enter the story. Not as a spectator, as a variable. Because when systems like this lock into place, the effects don't stay confined to briefing rooms and balance sheets. They surface in ordinary places, in prices that don't behave the way they used to, in markets that swing on announcements instead of fundamentals, in rules that feel stable right up until they aren't. You feel it when volatility becomes normal, when long-term assumptions stop holding, when legal protections you thought were neutral start depending on alignment. You don't have to follow geopolitics to be exposed to it. If you have savings, if you have investments, if your work is tied to supply chains, energy, or stability, this is how systemic power becomes personal. Not all at once, but persistently. And the hardest part is that none of this feels dramatic when it happens to you. It feels technical, administrative, inevitable. If this kind of analysis is helping you see the structure instead of the spectacle, stay with me. Share it, because the people most affected by these shifts are usually the last to be warned. And the next phase doesn't stay domestic. It never does. What's happening here doesn't stop at borders. Because once a system proves it can suspend rules to protect strategic assets, other systems take note. Allies recalibrate. Rivals adapt. Markets adjust their expectations. This is how a local action becomes a global signal. Energy doesn't move in isolation. It moves through currencies, through shipping lanes, through debt structures that assume predictability. When new supply is promised under extraordinary legal protection, it changes how everyone else prices risk. Not just oil, confidence. And confidence is contagious. Some countries read this as reassurance. Proof that the system will defend itself, that access will be secured. Others read it differently. As warning, as evidence that legal norms are conditional. That sovereignty is negotiable when it intersects with resources. That's when alternatives accelerate. Parallel payment systems, non-dollar trade, quiet hedging against exposure, none of this explodes overnight. It accumulates, and the danger isn't collapse, it's fragmentation. A world where rules still exist, but no longer apply evenly, where predictability depends on proximity to power. That kind of world doesn't announce itself. You realize you're in it only after decisions start carrying consequences you didn't vote for. And that brings us to the future. Not as a forecast, but as a set of paths already opening. From here, the system doesn't choose a single future. It opens three, all of them plausible, none of them clean. The first is adjustment. In this path, the machinery holds. Production resumes. Investment flows. Volatility settles into a new range. The intervention is framed as successful. Markets adapt. Institutions absorb the precedent and move on. Nothing breaks. But something changes permanently. Because once emergency power works this smoothly, it's never fully put away. The second path is erosion. Rules don't collapse. They thin. Each exception makes the next one easier. Each special case weakens the baseline. Confidence doesn't vanish. It leaks slowly enough that no single moment feels decisive. Fast enough that rebuilding it becomes impossible. The third path is rupture, not sudden, cascading. Legal uncertainty triggers capital flight. Supply promises collide with instability. The protection mechanisms start to conflict with each other. At that point, force returns, not necessarily military, but economic. Sanctions, counter-sanctions, fragmented systems pulling in opposite directions. Which path we take isn't decided yet. What's already decided is that the old equilibrium is gone. And the final question isn't what will happen, it's who will be prepared when it does. There's a temptation at moments like this to look for reassurance, for a clean ending, for proof that someone, somewhere, is fully in control. That's not how systems like this work. They don't collapse with a headline, they drift. They normalize. They teach everyone involved which lines can be crossed without consequence. What happened here wasn't loud. It didn't ask for your consent. It didn't need your attention, and that's why it matters. Because once legal limits become flexible in the service of urgency, the question stops being whether that power will be used again. It becomes where, and against whom, if you're waiting for a moment when this feels obvious, you'll miss it. The real shifts never feel dramatic while they're happening. They feel procedural. If this analysis helped you see the structure instead of the spectacle, don't stop here. The next layer is deeper, and it explains why these moves keep repeating and why they're accelerating now. Follow, stay close. Ask harder questions, because the system doesn't need belief to function. It only needs time, and it's already moving. If you want to understand what comes next, you'll need to be watching before it arrives.